In the 70s and 80s, Mike the Bike Rust was at the forefront of mountain biking, inventing the short and high chainstay and even putting 29-inch wheels on his clunker. 29-inch wheels in the 80s. But in 2009, he disappeared from his Colorado home after sending some disturbing texts, leaving the cycling world in shock. Let's unravel the haunting story of Mike Rust, from his legendary contributions to his tragic demise. No sponsorship for today's video because I want to keep emphasis on Robin's Ride. If you want to know more, the link is down below. Just know it's a big charity ride that we put on every year. It is coming up quick. If you would like to donate to it, links down below, and all the proceeds go to the Teal Butterflies. So if it is something that you're interested in, please, by all means, support. Mike Rust was a native of Colorado Springs and grew up in a rather large family. He had 5 brothers and 1 sister. With an early knack for tinkering, Mike built his first ever hodgepodge of a bicycle in the 7th grade. In the early 80s, Mike was all about off-road riding before it was freaking cool, which led him to having a big influence on his local mountain bike scene. There was this annual race over Pearl Pass, which Pearl Pass is this big high mountain pass at an elevation of almost 13,000 feet above sea level. It was a big race for the newly formed mountain bike scene. It was a titan. People from all over showed up to complete this challenge. But the scene was much different back then. Mountain bikers were kind of this subculture of people that wanted to try something challenging. It wasn't filled with endurance athletes like we know it today. There were miners and firefighters whose recovery was like chugging beers at the local bar, and they were all throwing legs over these new fancy off-road machines, and they were trying to be the first to make it through the pass. This was also the perfect testing grounds for the newly made mountain bikes. If you could make it through the entire pass without a single mechanical, then people knew your equipment was good.
Big rocks! And like, no brakes, hold on tight, clamp on, and...
Mike's first Pearl Pass tour was in 1980. I do really want to put an emphasis on how different the mountain biking culture was back then. This was a brand freaking new sport. This was not an endurance sport. This was not an Olympic sport. This was this brand new subculture of bikers. So I wouldn't even call them cyclists at the time. It was just something different and cool, and almost, it was more punk rock and a little bit of hippie than it was, you know, an endurance athletic endeavor. The legend himself, Gary Fisher, even competed in the event and stated that one of the most impressive riders at the time was none other than Mike Rust. He was an athletic specimen, but better than that, he was known as the master of conversion. See, back then you couldn't just show up at your local bike shop and pick out a mountain bike. Mike Rust would take old cruisers, put cantilever brakes on them, a derailleur, fatter tires, and send it over the mountain. He became revered in the community as someone who could make an extremely durable machine. He was working at a local bike shop at the time, and they could not keep up with the demand for Mike's machines. And this is something that I found really fascinating. These things were not cheap to build, and not every bike was suitable for a conversion. If you were willing to invest in a conversion from Mike, you would have to contact him, and a crew of off-roaders would take you out on what they would call a shakedown run. And they would do this before they even entertained of letting you pay them to convert your bike. This was to ensure that the frame could even handle the terrain. And if you made it through that run, you were in. As I stated above, Mike had a huge influence on the local scene. He had his hand in building teams, making stage races, holding weekly events, and the mountain bike craze just blew up in the area.
We come out the next year, it's all changed. They're athletes. They know what they're doing now. And there's a bike shop in town. Man, there was racing going on and everything. And they went, okay, man. They blew it up.
But at the time, Mike also wanted a new mountain bike, something dedicated to this new sport, something that handled just as good as his nimble little road racer, something a little shorter in the rear end and a tighter wheelbase that would make it climb so much better than the beach cruisers. This thing was not around. It was not an item to purchase, so he decided to make his own. Don McClung was a strong racer at the time, and this idea really intrigued him. In 1985, Don and Mike started Colorado Cyclery and built their first elevated chainstay bike, dubbed the Shorty. dubbed the Shorty. In Don's own words, they made these bikes because they couldn't buy what they wanted. These Shorty bikes also had a much bigger influence on the entire mountain bike scene. Gary Fisher even stated that he designed numerous bikes after the Shorty. Heck, my brand new Giant Anthem boasts that the chainstays are shorter for better control and power transfer. All of this can be traced back to Mike Rust and Don McClung. They were not engineers at the time. They were not even welders. But they knew what they wanted and they figured out how to build it. Mike and Don also knew something that no one else did at the time. The 29-inch wheel size was the way to go. They modified a Shorty frame and fork to accept the bigger wheel size, and they dominated the local trails. And just for the unindoctrinated, the name 29er comes from a bicycle called the 2-9er, which was offered by the Gary Fisher Bike Company in 2001. That bike is kind of recognized as the first official mega big brand offering of a 29er, like on a mass-produced scale. If you look in like the Mountain Bike Hall of Fame, the U.S. division of Bianchi Bicycles actually offered a line of 29-inch wheeled off-road bikes beginning in 1991 called the Project bikes. And I say all that to kind of show you how innovative these guys were. They were not just engineers and builders of things. They were the mountain bikers at the time. They were the cyclists. They were the testers. So when they would go out and test something, they'd come back and go, how can we make this better? They were putting stuff on their bikes that didn't make it to market for 20 more years. And this is something that really always fascinated me about hearing Mike's story. This guy is not a businessman. He did not really care about wealth or becoming wealthy. He didn't want to do any marketing. He just loved cycling. Mike was known as a hard person, which is documented very well in The Rider and the Wolf. I will leave a link down below to this fabulous documentary. Feel free to watch it. It's on Vimeo for free. Support that project. It's pretty good. But just know he grew up in a big family and was one of the youngest. The Rust brothers specialized in something other than mountain biking. They made penny farthings, the high-wheeled bicycles of old. But with these bikes, there was no freewheel, there wasn't even a brake sometimes, and the gearing was all determined by the size of the wheel that you chose. These were simple machines. And perched upon his big-wheeled behemoth, Mike and his brothers accomplished a lot. And it's all documented well in The Rider and the Wolf. Like, they got to ride in Dublin for the St. Patrick's Day parade. They did ride the Rockies on their high wheels, which it blows my mind. That seems pretty difficult to do. Through all of this, Mike was seemingly the central figure within the brothers, especially when it came to the high wheelers. Mike was the strongest and he was always leading the pack. This was the late 80s, early 90s. Now, the same thing that happens to most friends and family inevitably happened to Mike and his crew. They grew up and they grew apart. Him and his brothers would get together 2 or 3 times a year and reminisce about old times, Christmas, Thanksgiving, that sort of thing. But the days of the rolling Rust brothers were over. All of them had moved on to different stages of their life. Mike called his longtime sweetheart Marianne and took her out to lunch today. At 7 p.m., she got a call from Mike saying that someone had been in his house and stole his gun. She didn't hear from him all night long, and the next day word started to spread. His brothers and his mother knew that Mike was missing, and at this point, all searches were a go. Marianne and the brothers arrived at Mike's house, saw the box that the gun had been in sitting on the kitchen table, and Mike's binoculars were sitting there as if he immediately started scanning the horizon, looking for whoever invaded his home. His wallet, his cell phone, the groceries, they were all sitting in their place in the kitchen. It looked like Mike had come home, saw what happened, immediately threw his crap down, and just took off after whoever it was. Like one of his brothers said, it was as if he was here a second ago, put his stuff down, and he will be right back. They searched his house all night long for clues as to what happened, but when Mike didn't come home for the second night in a row, they all feared the worst. So at this point, the only things that were missing were Mike himself, his pistol, and he took off on his red Honda motorcycle. Mike was still living in Salida, Colorado, but after Father Time started creeping up on him and his crew, he started to have a growing disillusionment with society and with the way that Americans lived. Mike had always been a free spirit, but he was a little more than that. He never cared for money, always enjoyed the simpler life, and wholeheartedly believed that if you needed something, why not just make it? And unlike most people, Mike needed zero validation from anyone. Mike sold his share of the bicycle business and almost stopped riding altogether. Salida was getting a little bit too expensive to live in, so he started looking for land somewhere more remote. He packed his things up and moved to where a little plot of land was waiting for him. 80 acres of freedom and 40 miles to the next store, where the only time you could see your next door neighbor was at night when their dim light would be on in the horizon. This is the exact opposite of a city. There were no building codes, and Mike loved that idea. It took a while, but he went from literally a makeshift shack to an actual home. This was his play place.
This is pretty wild. Whoa! All right, we won't do that too much anymore.
Mike was a peaceful man largely, but he never backed down from anyone. At worst, he was confrontational, but for the most part, he really just wanted to be left alone to enjoy his way of life. In 2009, after Mike disappeared, it was all hands on deck to find out what happened to him. With all of their resources at their disposal, they couldn't find a freaking bright red motorcycle, which is no knock on the law enforcement, the brothers, anybody that was helping the search. I just can't stress enough how vast this land was that Mike was living on. It would be an insurmountable task to try to find anybody out there. But then a break happened. A vest and a partial butt of a pistol handle and a little bit of blood were found. They were able to determine that the blood was in fact from Mike. At this point, the Rust family had been through a lot. One brother succumbed to cancer, another committed suicide, and now Mike was missing. With the help of some friends, it was the remaining Rust brothers that made their sole purpose in life for the next little bit to find out what happened to Mike. They arranged their own search parties and started turning over every single rock in this vast wilderness. It might take a lifetime, but they were determined to find him. As his brother Marty puts it, they were in limbo. It seemed like an impossible task, but if they stopped looking, what would happen to Mike? He would be forgotten, and he couldn't let that happen to Mike. 6 years went by. 6 years of searching for Mike. 6 years of his brothers setting up grids, trying to find out what happened to their sibling. But then, after the 6 years went by, a retired FBI agent that had worked the case called the brothers and told them that he was standing on some private property that they were not allowed to access before, and he is 99% sure that he found Mike. The agent sent over a photo of a belt buckle that was with the remains, and they knew right away that it was him. After all this time, Mike had been found. The quick and dirty of it is that some kid got in trouble with the law and snitched on another friend of his who turned around and snitched on his father, Charlie Gonzalez, the man who took Mike's life. So Charlie ended up robbing Mike, and when Mike finally caught up with him, Charlie and an accomplice kicked and beat Mike almost to death, and then finally finished him off with a shot from the pistol. Charles was arrested for this act, and he took full responsibility, but claims it was all in self-defense. Said that there was a scuffle and a misunderstanding, that he was only looking for firewood at Mike's place, and that the pistol accidentally went off, and he was just scared to tell anyone what happened. Charles Gonzalez was sentenced by jury to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Also, Charles claims that Mike came after him with his pistol in hand, said that he was just at Mike's place looking for firewood, but if you see the videos of where Mike lived, there's no reason why you would be near his house looking for firewood. Mike also, when he called Marianne and left her that voicemail, said that someone had stolen his pistol, and that's what he was going after. It was an attack on his innocent play place, if that makes sense. And he moved out there to be able to fly when he wanted to be able to ride motorcycles, to not have anybody tell him what he can and can't do, and it got violated, and that's why he got mad. And when he got mad about it, he chased after the guy, which ultimately led to his demise. And it is little consolation that the criminal was finally caught since Mike's life was taken. But it's better to know what happened and to close the case than to be left wondering for the rest of your life. Mike was an interesting man who could care less about societal norms, money, or what people thought about him, but above all else, he was a human being who had his life taken from him. It's a sad way to end the story of a very interesting guy, but I'm glad that I got to research his life a bit. Mike was a big influence on the mountain bike scene when the sport was exploding, and I think it's a shame if that history is forgotten. The guy was at the forefront of SPD pedals, 29-inch wheels, short chainstays, and his reach extended further into the cycling world than I think even he would have thought.
There's just $1 million worth of view. Big time. Oh, There's a cold beer on that table. Needs a little rescuing, perhaps. Anyway, that was so nice to have you stop by for a little tour around, you know, and as I get more civilization, I'll be showing you some more, and we'll be stacking some other stuff on top of this too, but first we have to have kind of, we're just having a marvelous dinner. Deluxe out here, and the beer.
Thank you all for watching. I found Mike's story very interesting, and I barely scratched the surface. This just is almost to get you guys interested in it. You know I love these history-style videos, and if you would like to know his story more in depth, down below I will link to The Rider and the Wolf. That's what I got for you. If you have any suggestions on anything related to bicycles that you would like to know the history of, let me know. I'm always taking ideas. And I got this one from the comments below. I love you all. See you in the next one. Bye-bye.